We are just hours away now from the start of the first trilateral summit between the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and the United States. U.S. President Joe Biden will host the day-long meeting at the presidential retreat outside Washington, D.C. For more details, we go live now to Voice of America's Jessica Stone. She resides in Washington, D.C. Jessica, good morning.
Good morning to you.
All right, Jessica, this is the first standalone summit these leaders have held. Their own trilateral approach to security and prosperity. What's the significance of their approach?
Well, it's taken some time, as you may know, to get Japan and South Korea to work this closely together. Of course, Japan ruled South Korea for 35 years prior to the end of the Japanese surrender at the end of World War II. So there's a lot of historic differences between these two countries. And historically, the United States has attempted to play a bit of a mediator, trying to get them on the same page. But there really was a catalyst earlier this year with the election of Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol. He made the first trip in 12 years for an official visit to Tokyo back in March, and that was followed by another round of visits in May. There have been several trilateral meetings on the sidelines of various summits at the defense level, the security level, the diplomatic level, and now all of this leads here to the Trilateral Summit at Camp David, the historic presidential retreat outside Washington, D.C., that has been used for many historic opportunities, including, of course, in the 70s, the Middle East peace accords that were signed under President Jimmy Carter. So you think of this as the backdrop. Certainly, common concerns have drawn these three countries closer together, including a nuclear North Korea, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and an increasingly aggressive China in the South China Sea, as well as in the Taiwan Straits. Here is how former Ambassador James Jeffrey spoke to VOA about the message that these three countries are sending, both to Moscow and to Beijing.
They're sending a strong message, and I would say the message is don't go any further and do not try to seize Taiwan militarily, or things will get a lot worse for anybody who does that. That's, I think, the underlying message. They're willing to live with Russia, they're willing to live with China, but they do not want further attacks on the international order, and that's a strong message they're sending.
Now we're going to moving on to the next question is what's on the agenda for the summit and what are the expected outcomes?
Yeah, so they're going to have a meeting in about 5 hours' time, several bilateral meetings as well as trilateral meetings, and then they're going to have a press conference at 3 p.m. local. So that's when we expect to hear the outcomes of this meeting. The agenda expected to cover both Indo-Pacific security as well as economic prosperity, including supply chain resilience. Of course, there is a growing movement worldwide to not decouple, but de-link, de-risk various supply chains from the decisions that China makes. We certainly saw some risk in how they handled the pandemic and the extended shutdowns there. So many countries around the world are working on that. Significant outcomes include joint military exercises between these three countries, really focusing on interoperability. This is a key for Washington. They want interoperability of these three militaries when it comes to weapon systems, but also when it comes to information sharing, including radar and satellite technology. And they're expected to practice shooting down ICBMs. Of course, there's an increased threat of ICBMs we've seen in the last several days. North Korea launch additional missile tests. And then they're also going to announce what's called a duty to consult. This is diplomatic parlance for three countries deciding that one threat against one basically equivocates or is the equivalent of a threat against all of them. And so this would be a scenario in which a threat against, let's say, South Korea is made, and all three countries immediately consult. They're going to create a high-tech hotline in order for them to be able to do that. And then they would come up with a policy response in tandem. These three countries also looking to create tighter cooperation, as I said earlier, against supply chain risks. And ultimately, the goal of this trilateral summit and this trilateral framework is to create a system that stays in place past the presidency of Joe Biden, the presidency of Yoon Suk-yeol, and the prime ministership of Mr. Kishida of Japan, essentially creating something that cannot be changed by subsequent elections. And that's really been key, of course, because we've seen a lot of changing approaches to Asia foreign policy here in the United States, as well as in Seoul. Ballerina?
Okay. Well, another key issue all three nations want to work together on is combating nuclear North Korea. What's the reaction to this summit in Pyongyang, and how is Beijing reacting?
Yeah, it's a good question because we often see very visceral and evocative and provocative reactions, particularly from Pyongyang. In this case, South Korean parliamentarians have briefed reporters with the idea that there could be a North Korean ICBM launch in protest of this trilateral summit. So we're watching for that. Part of the expected outcomes of this summit, of course, is that these three countries would share real-time reporting on any nuclear activities and nuclear buildups in North Korea, and that would allow them to both deter and potentially defend if there were a contingency in which they need to do so. This is an expansion, really, of the nuclear consultative group we saw announced back in July. And you'll recall that for the first time, the U.S. sent a nuclear-armed submarine to Busan, South Korea, as part of the effort to continue to deter North Korea. As for Beijing's response, China says the summit is, quote, undermining the post-Cold War economic order. And it, in turn, has begun to really double down on its relationships with Japan and South Korea, asking for increased engagement with both of them. So we'll be watching what happens today at the summit, some of the body language, and see if these former, in particular with Japan and South Korea, see if these former adversaries at times can really move forward, keep the past in the past, and move forward against the joint challenges that they face in the future. Ballerina?
Well, thank you very much, Jessica Stone, for joining us today on TVR World.
A pleasure.